Narrows Cayley, inheritance dream. America's shores beckon the younger, flourish childless, breeding his horses. Thomas Coleman, brother to a queen.
When viewed through the lens of time, many of the events spicing the lives of Estolians are as interconnected and intricate as the web of the Estolian orb weaver. Seemingly independent, many events come together to form a framework funneling the lives of Estolians towards some set destination that only Deity understands. One need only look at the genealogical record of Peter Cathay to see how intricate and forward-seeing Deity can be. From Cathay, nearly 1600 years ago, to Peter, to my mother, the lineage of Estolia comes full circle. I was twice destined to be king. Isaiah Monterey Zakarian, Capitulo 88.
California, 1971. Nate frowned at the near-illegible street sign, driving slowly. Yes, it said Northeastern Boulevard. A pretentious name for what amounted to little better than a dirt track. It was midday, but the light was already failing in the face of the storm that was rushing inland. Snow was forecast for the Sierra Nevada mountain range, but down here in the valley it would mostly just rain. After the truck idled for a couple of minutes, Nate shifted the truck into a lower gear and moved forward slowly.
"You'll miss the turnoff if you're not paying attention,"
the old-sounding woman had stated.
"To keep from missing it."
She went on to explain what sounded like complicated instructions based on the speed of the vehicle and the tempo of breathing. He simply paid attention. The cutoff, when it came, was just as she described it, forming a very sharp angle he had to maneuver around, difficult when pulling a trailer. Once he was on the correct road, he recalled the next set of instructions she had given him.
"You'll know you're on the right road because you'll see some of our stock to the right."
In the paddock he saw half a dozen scruffy miniature horses. If his truck was not finicky in reverse, he might have backed away from continuing to his destination. But he was not the kind of man to set up an appointment and not follow through. He just gripped the steering wheel tightly and ran the conversation through his mind.
"The weatherwise say it will be a rough winter, so our horses are already looking a little unkempt because of their winter coats. Please don't judge us by their appearance. They're not for sale and not kept in the stable and groomed daily. You'll be impressed with the little Palomino."
Princess of Galloway. If she was everything they advertised, she was exactly what he wanted, what he needed. From the time he learned about her availability, he was excited by the possibilities. He had been saving up for this purchase for the last 6 months. More than half the winter sky was nearly black with the impending storm by the time he pulled into the stable yard. The house looked like it could be rented out as a haunted house in October. Black, with peeling paint, several windows boarded up, and half the porch collapsed. To his left was the stable block. He knew instinctively that he would approve of the little filly. Where his own homestead was far more well kept, he did spend more money on the stable than he spent on his house. He had his priorities and these people seemed to share them. Horses first. Personal comfort second, if at all. The approach of the two wiry individuals from the direction of the stable did not surprise him. He recognized the older woman immediately. She was at the summer sale when he first saw the golden Palomino stallion. He could not afford the animal. But when he had the option to purchase a filly with the same bloodlines, he could not pass it up. The older woman was the one who sold the stallion. He climbed out of his truck and turned to the couple. The woman was probably in her 50s, and the man with her was 30-something. Perhaps 10 years younger than Nate's 45 years.
"Nate Coleman?"
the older woman said.
"Yep,"
he said. She nodded curtly.
"The storm is coming on fast, so we'd best get a move on."
She turned and made her way back to the stable block. The young man was not introduced to him, but he did not care about that. His interest was not in finding new friends, It was acquiring the exquisite Palomino filly, if she was everything they claimed she would be. The younger man switched on lights as they entered the stable. Nate's breath left him in a low-pitched exclamation of delight. She was perfect. For the next 15 minutes they discussed her bloodline, her conformation, her potential offspring, and then finally the woman said,
"You own Shake of Sands?"
His most extraordinary animal, he proudly confirmed that he owned the young stallion.
"I'm hoping to set her to him this next season,"
he said, gesturing to the princess.
"We were thinking,"
she said, pulling the younger man closer,
"if you would consider a deal."
24 hours later, the storm was still raging. Nate was able to make a deal that cut the cost of the filly in half, and assured that his new stallion might make a name for himself sooner than he otherwise could have. It was as if, at 45 years old, he had finally become someone in the elite circle of breeders of miniature horses. Perhaps in a couple of years he would bring a stallion to the shows, one who would become a champion. That the old woman knew he owned Shake of Sands was exciting all by itself.
Inheritance, dream, child of his child, descendant in line. 3 sons exceed his wildest dreams. Thomas Coleman, brother to a queen. A gentleman in England married again. In the 11th hour he had a son, Thomas Coleman, brother to a queen. Reggie's Kaylee, inheritance dream.
In my studies of religion and the ancient world of Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, I was surprised by how thoroughly Estolia, and her influence on the culture and infancy of civilization, was obscured. Though I searched diligently, I found only 3 references to Centrath. The first was one of the few surviving maps of Centrath created by Estolian mapmakers. It was a source of both profit and misdirection to early Estolia. It detailed the coastal and port cities ringing the western Mediterranean, or Centrath, as Estolians called it. But Estolia was masked as the hazardous rocky island called Pequeño, and as a result, marauders considered it inhospitable. Xavier Archimedes Zakarian, Capítulo 86.
He was checking his Christmas TV dinner when something made him uneasy. Closing his oven, he straightened up and looked around his kitchen. What was it? It was so silent he could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock. Once he made that observation, he understood. The staccato sound of the driving rain had finally eased off. It was the silence, the absence of the sound of the storm, that he was hearing. He turned off the stove, but when he reached for the oven door handle, he frowned and then looked from the clock, to the window and to the kitchen door. What if he heard something else? What if a coyote was menacing his herd? Or the new little princess? He could not risk it. His dinner would wait. He also wanted to make sure that she was settling into her new surroundings. Any excuse to go look at her was worth it. He went to his kitchen door and pulled his oil slicker off the hook, putting it on before pulling the door open. With a whistle, Capulet, his Australian shepherd, jumped to his feet and followed him out of the kitchen. Everything was quiet in the stable, but predators could be quite stealthy. He would not be content until he saw the new filly and reassured himself that she was safe. She nickered softly when he turned on her light. He entered her stall and was thrilled when she came right up to him. She was everything he wanted. He picked up a brush and spent some time grooming her. He was just stepping out of the stall when Capulet growled and looked towards one of the empty stalls at the far end of the stable. Nate set a hand on Capulet's head, quieting him. Together man and dog went slowly, stealthily towards the unused end of the stable block. As they drew even with the final stall, he felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. On the ground in front of the closed stall door he saw muddy tracks. Small footprints, of the human variety. Cautiously he unlatched the top half of the stall door and prepared to swing it open. With a glance towards his canine companion he took a deep breath, flipped the stall light on, and pulled open the door. His first impression was a mop of red curls and a dirty face. He wished it was a coyote or a wolf. Those he could deal with, but what was he supposed to do with a child? He looked again at his dog, and Capulet whined at him, as if to say that he didn't know what to do either. Reluctantly he opened the stall door. It was below 40 degrees. He could not leave the child out in the stable. When he approached her, she lifted her arms to him. He was taken aback at the trust in her grubby face and hesitated only a second before picking her up. Spying a filthy blanket, he picked that up, and then left the stall. As he flicked off the lights, Capulet danced happily around his legs, excited by this new element in his universe. When Nate reached the stall of his new princess, he looked in on her one more time before closing the door and flipping off the lights. Back in his house, he was not sure what he was supposed to do with the small human being in his arms. He looked around his bachelor kitchen and could not figure out what to do with the child. With a grunt, he decided to keep her close while he called for help. Settling her to the counter, he picked up the phone and dialed the operator. The sun was shining brilliantly down on the paddock 4 months later. Nate was admiring the new addition to his herd that was foaled the previous night when the sheriff's car slowly came to a halt next to the fence. Nate finished his inspection of the new foal, a leopard-spotted Appaloosa filly, before turning his attention to the sheriff.
I don't reckon I ever really paid much attention to yon miniatures.
The sheriff said.
But they really are beautiful. I can see why you breed them.
Nate inclined his head and looked back at the 3 mares and the tiny foals who were gambling in the sweet winter grasses.
They have their challenges, but they are much easier to manage than a wife or kids.
The sheriff chuckled. After several minutes spent watching the foals, the 2 men turned away once all 3 seemed to decide simultaneously that it was supper time.
Thought you'd like to hear what we learned about the babe you discovered in your stable.
The sheriff said. Nate was not sure he really cared all that much, but the sheriff wanted to tell him.
She had the name Cater Cicero written on her arm. Doc Marshall thinks she's about a year old. Until we find out who she is, Doc says we'll just set her birthday as January 1st. Her clothing was 20 years out of fashion, and her blanket was a Kmart special.
Nate just grunted. Suddenly he wondered.
You're not fixing to tell me I have to take her, are you?
The sheriff shook his head.
Because we don't know when we'll discover her real parents. She can't be adopted out. Bob Kettinger over in Barstow tells me that it's not likely we'll ever figure it out. All the evidence was in the warehouse that burnt up last week.
He shrugged.
Thanks for letting me know.
Nate said. His eyes turned back to the new foal, no longer concerned with the young child that had for a day made his life too exciting.
How could she be taken, stolen, removed? Who'd leave her forsaken, with nobody left to love?
It is considered a truism that Deity will ensure that the tribulations faced by the sons of Zacharias are not beyond their inherent abilities. I often reflected on it in my later years, as I considered the many events taking place in my younger life. When I lost my foot, I felt as if Deity was giving me the most difficult trial of my life. The strength of character this revealed within me was a critical foundation I could rely upon during the events that transpired only a few months later. Ulysses Anatoli, Capítulo 37.
Hallows End, California, 1991.
Caderin pulled Leela's small foot into her lap. She demonstrated the technique for tying shoelaces. The tip of Leela's tongue was barely visible as she concentrated on the lesson. She successfully followed the same steps on her other shoe. When she finished, she stood up and gave Caderin an enthusiastic hug before running off to join the other children.
Your daughter is very beautiful.
An accented voice spoke behind her. She turned and saw a man looking at her with a smile on his face. Caderin looked over to where Whitney was standing next to Thomas. She waved to her friend.
She's not my daughter. She's the daughter of a friend of mine.
The man settled on the grass next to her. He was wearing a business suit, unsuitable for sitting on the grass in the park.
You do not have children of your own?
He asked her. She laughed.
No, that would require a husband.
She looked out at the children playing at the nearby jungle gym. Sighing softly, she wished, not for the first time, that she was a wife and mother.
Surely not for want of opportunity,
he said. She turned to look at him. He was attractive with light brown hair and eyes. His accent was so subtle, it was hard for her to place where he was from.
True love is far harder to come by than the romantics would have you believe,
she said noncommittally. Seeing her friend preparing to leave the park, she clambered to her feet.
Excuse me?
She said, leaving him to cross the park to her friend's side.
Who was that?
Whitney asked. Caderin looked back to where the man was climbing to his feet, brushing grass off his trousers. Shrugging, she turned away from him.
Just someone here enjoying the park, I'd guess.
Thomas moved closer to Whitney, his arm bowing around her shoulders, reaching for Leela's hand.
We have to be going now. Do you mind?
He asked. She shook her head.
Not at all. I hope you three have a lovely day.
After their departure, she left the park, heading to the large house where she rented a bedroom on the top floor. She was almost to the gate leading to the house when she was halted by an accented voice.
Perhaps you would allow me to take you out for a coffee.
She turned and looked at the businessman walking towards her with a pronounced limp. She shook her head and said,
I would like that, however. I have someplace I have to be.
He nodded.
I should have known a woman as beautiful as you would be taken.
She cocked her head to the side and looked at him quizzically. Few men ever looked her way, and nobody had ever called her beautiful.
I have to go to work right now, but thank you for the offer.
Perhaps I might call you sometime,
he asked, persevering.
I'll be out of town on a job for the next 10 days,
she said.
But feel free to give me a call afterward.
My name is Ezekiel Zakarian, but my family calls me Zeke.
He extended his hand. She expected a handshake but was flustered when he drew her hand up to his mouth, kissing it. She felt the warmth of a blush stained her cheeks. Her freckled face would resemble lumpy oatmeal surrounded by a froth of short orange-red curls.
I'm Caderin Cicero,
she said. Normally she would not include her last name when meeting a stranger, but she felt compelled to reciprocate his introduction with one of similar detail. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a pen and a small notebook and asked,
May I have your phone number?
She told him the number and then said,
I really must go now, or I'll be late.
She was aware of his eyes on her while she went through the gate, walked up to the house, and let herself in, shutting the door behind her. Upstairs in her room, she went to the window and looked down on the residential street below. He was gone. Ezekiel was his name. She said it out loud. It was poetical. She liked it. Zeke sounded ordinary next to the lovely sound of his full name. Ezekiel. He was attractive, she mused, but she could not understand why he thought she was. She always thought of herself as petite, flat-chested, angular, and with a riot of short day-glow orange curls framing a face covered in a few thousand freckles closely packed over every inch of skin that was exposed to the sun. She felt like a Dalmatian. She pulled out her suitcase and started to pack. Her motions were automatic. She amused herself during her packing by thoughts of the handsome stranger, imagining that he had fallen in love with her and was planning to court her. She looked at the romance novels on her second-hand bookshelf and snorted. Women in romance novels tended to be beautiful with dark sultry good looks, or blonde beauty. Even the redheads were gorgeous with no sign of freckles to mar their creamy complexions. They all had breasts that allowed for beautiful cleavage when they dressed up. No, she thought, nobody would write a romantic story about her forgettable looks. Even her parents decided she wasn't worth their time when they dumped her in a stable with nothing more than a name. Catherine snapped the suitcase shut briskly, trying to shut away the unhappy trend her thoughts were taking. She had a 10-day commission working with an actress at her San Francisco home, painting her twin daughters. She needed to focus on her job and ignore the intangibles of her puzzling parentage or the improbability of some handsome foreigner falling in love with her. She carried the suitcase down to the foyer, setting it down next to her art supplies. Poking her head into the kitchen, she smiled at her landlady.
I'll be back in 10 days to 2 weeks, Amanda.
Amanda looked up from the wedding cake she was icing and smiled at her.
I'll hold down the fort while you're away.
Catherine carried everything outside and saw a car idling at the curb. The actress told her she was sending a car to drive her to her estate. A man got out of the car and looked at her.
Did Kitty send you to drive me to her home?
She asked. He looked at her with raised eyebrows, his eyes traveling over her forgettable face and figure. He looked faintly incredulous, like he could not believe she was the artist he had been sent to fetch. Only after he finished looking her over did he confirm that he was the one sent by Kitty. He opened the back door of the car for her. While she climbed into the back, he slung her suitcases, canvases and paints into the trunk. The car was a luxury model, including a car phone and every other modern perk. Exactly the sort of vehicle she would expect Kitty to send. She closed her eyes and relaxed as the car left the suburban neighborhood. She was more successful as a portrait painter than she cared for, and being a name amongst the jet set left her feeling flat. Most of her subjects were either the spoiled animals or children of spoiled adults. Few of her commissions left her with any real appreciation of the so-called high life. She wished she could choose her clients, but her agent often reminded her that the plastic people were as apt to grow cold to her talents as to continue to laud them. She would do well to take what she could get while she was a hot commodity.
Abducted, removed from home, little child. Alone, abandoned, secrets about mysteries unsolved. Promises of deity, nightly sparkles of starlight, stellar synchronicity, celestial streamers at night. Sparkling instrument of fate, glorious glow of the aura, treasure map to liberate, hope contained by Pandora.
When Michael Othello asked for clarification of Estolian beliefs regarding marriage, I explained as best as I could to someone who would never have their soul kept by another. I told him that, in our faith, a man must marry sometime after dusk on the night before his 30th birthday, and midnight, the night before his 31st birthday. Few outsiders ever receive so frank a discussion as we had on that monumental day. I explained that Deity was there to guide us if we needed it, in the form of the aura, that bright beacon of light that heralds a union that will be sanctioned by Deity. I did not, however, go so far as to explain to him that our marriage ceremony always begins with the consummation and ends with a formal uniting. In retrospect, I believe he knew, and was glad I did not go into further detail. Lazarus Ezekiel Zakarion, Capitulo 88.
Zeke recalled the conversation he had with his uncle Theo almost a full year ago, as the sun was setting on his 30th birthday. Originally, he planned to visit the Zacharian Enterprises offices in Europe and North America, while also instituting a search for his Kaylee. With 3 weeks to go before his birthday, he had great faith he would find his Kaylee in the first few days. Zeke was at the Amador airport, standing on the tarmac preparing to climb into the airplane that would take him to the first stop on his itinerary. He and his uncle were arguing about something when one of the carriage horses kicked him. The blow snapped his leg, knocking him to the tarmac, leaving him writhing in pain with a compound fracture of his tibia. His injury was so extreme, doctors were afraid at first that he would lose the leg. He underwent several operations as the doctors worked to save it. The day before his birthday they finally declared the danger of losing his leg over, and allowed him to return to the palace to convalesce. But he had months of intense therapy before he would be able to leave Estolia to go on the planned tour. In the meantime, his assistant, Marcus Albans, traveled without him to the California office to handle the business part of their itinerary. Once he was situated in his spacious rooms, Zeke stared at the luxurious walls in disillusionment. How could he be denied the most precious of all blessings? He was destined to be keeper. He should be able to experience all her greatest blessings so he could speak with authority while counseling those in need of his words. It seemed as if Deity had forsaken him. The sheer randomness of a carriage horse striking him without cause made the incident suspect. As if the only purpose had been to deny him the joy of knowing the keeper of his soul on his actual birthday. When his uncle joined him, he shared his concern, his feeling of betrayal, his anger at being denied. Uncle Theo told him, quietly, as they watched the sun set on his 30th birthday.
Zeke, do you recall the blessing you received when you became your brother's last resort? You were warned then that you would not easily find your Kaylee.
Zeke thought back to the blessing. It was a very long blessing, and most of it expounded with extraordinary insight on his pivotal role in the rule of Estolia during his forthcoming tenure as last resort, as first consul, and as the keeper. However, there had been a small part of the blessing about his Kaylee. The bottom line for that section of the blessing had been what every Estolian wanted to hear: he would find her, and she would be worthy of him, and he of her. Since that was what he wanted to hear, he did not spend much time or effort focusing on those details when so many other details seemed more critical. His uncle pushed the official copy of the blessing towards him, tapping one section.
For any son of Zacharias blessed to keep the soul of Estolia, the woman who will keep his soul is, and always shall be, the most critical and significant role for any person in Estolia. Only if his soul is safely and securely kept can he in turn grant Estolia the safe keeping of her soul. You will find your Kaylee. You will win her. She will feel the compulsion to take your soul into her keeping, but finding her will be difficult. Once you do encounter her, with her aura emblazoned upon your heart, she will be easy to win, and yet winning her will test your faith. Time will fight against you, and chaos will surround her. Never doubt the promises of Deity. Aggressively seek your Kaylee, and above all else be mindful you consummate the union prior to your 31st birthday.
Appalled, Zeke asked his uncle.
I have to wait until I'm nearly 31 before I'm wed.
Theo shrugged.
You will need to follow the urging of the Spirit. Do not forget the blessing.
Glorious glow of the aura, treasure map to liberate, hope contained by Pandora.
Now, almost a full year later, Zeke thought back to that conversation with a sense of sureness and peace surrounding his destiny and fate. His struggles to heal and recuperate from his injury, and the occasional despair he felt, was part of his own pathway forward. Catherine Sicero had always been destined to be his Kaylee. Not only would she hold close the very real substance of his soul, but she already held his heart and mind. She would be, and in fact already was, his everything. He had 3 weeks remaining before his birthday. In the time available to him, he would make sure he caught her heart, soul, and imagination as quickly as possible. The trials detailed in his blessing were now behind him. His future was secure. When he stopped in to visit with Thaddeus Montclair on his first day in California, He learned that Thaddeus had an emergency and would not be available for an hour, so Zeke had decided to go for a walk around the block to stretch his legs after his flight from Estolia. He did not expect to be near blinded by the aura of the woman who would keep his soul. But that was how Deity worked, to make certain those who gave the most to the nation would receive the greatest blessings. If Thaddeus was not detained, he would have never bumped into the fascinating Caiderin. And her aura was beautiful in so many ways. As promised by Deity, it provided him reassurance that she was capable of keeping his soul, pure in body and mind, able to accept living in Estolia.
Promises of deity, nightly sparkles of starlight, stellar synchronicity, celestial streamers at night. Sparkling instrument of fate, glorious glow of the aura.
Eternally we thrive, your essence wraps around me. In your light I'm finally free. Your aura sets my spirit free. Bring me to my destiny.
What man, what sane man, would yield up his soul willingly, given the choice, especially if he knew each of the ramifications of that act? I have heard that it leaves a man in actual pain when apart from his wife, or as Estolians say it, their Kaylee. Before I left Estolia, one of the artisans accidentally severed an artery, and in minutes she was dead. Her husband, barely 40 years old, died in his sleep that night. Nobody was alarmed by his death. What alchemy do the women of Estolia practice on their men that they should accept such a one-sided deal? Quincy Lucellus Amador, Memoirs, footnote 18, second paragraph.
Caiderin felt the car pull off the freeway and opened her eyes, expecting to see the streets of San Francisco with their maelstrom of colors and textures. It would likely be another half hour once they were on the city streets to get to Kitty's estate. But they were nowhere near the bustling, overcrowded streets of the city.
Where are we? Where are you taking me?
Instead of San Francisco, they were driving up into some rural inland foothills. The land around her was rich with the colors of a California countryside, mellow sienna, ochre, umbers, and yellows. They were somewhere east or north of their starting point. The driver did not reply verbally, but the car's speed increased. She felt a shiver of fear. This car was not sent by Kitty. 10 minutes later, he growled.
I will pull over in a minute so that you may speak on the phone. Do I have to tie you up to keep you from attempting to escape?
The driver spoke with a thick accent that was, nevertheless, understandable. They were in the middle of nowhere. If she tried to get away, this man would catch her. He was a large man, next to her own petite build. She wouldn't stand a chance.
I won't try to run away.
He pulled over next to an old burnt-out gas station. A lonely public payphone, clearly defunct, stood isolated from everything else. The driver pulled to a halt next to the payphone but did nothing else. A phone started to ring. She frowned at the phone outside the window. The driver cleared up her confusion when he answered the car phone in a foreign language and then handed it to her.
Caiderin?
It was Ezekiel.
Are you okay?
He sounded scared and tense. Her eyes went to the man who had abducted her and she jumped when he growled impatiently.
Tell him how you are doing.
Her voice was shaky as she said,
I think I've been kidnapped.
Another voice came over the line, deep, somber, menacing.
She has been kidnapped, Mr. Zacharian, and if you want to see her again, you will do exactly what we tell you to do.
The line went dead and Caiderin looked at the phone in consternation. When the driver extended his hand, Caiderin handed the phone to him. Should she tell him she barely knew Ezekiel? Before she could decide, the driver pulled away from the payphone and was again speeding down the rural road. She could describe the face of the man who had abducted her. These people probably thought of her as expendable. They were never going to let her go. Not alive. No matter what Ezekiel did. Why would he do anything for her when they had only just met each other? The car finally stopped outside a remote farmhouse. Both back doors of the car were opened simultaneously by equally large and brutal-looking men who also made no attempt to hide their faces. One of them growled at her.
Are you going to give us any trouble? Or do you plan to cooperate?
Why should I? You're going to kill me, aren't you? I could identify you to the police.
She concentrated on speaking with calm detachment. If they did have a compelling reason to keep her alive, if they could convince her she would come to no harm, she would cooperate. But she could see no purpose in going meekly to her death. An older man stepped out of the house and said in a weak, reedy voice,
"Jones, see to the room upstairs. I will speak with Miss Cicero."
He climbed into the car and settled into the back seat next to her.
"You may call me Joseph.
He wheezed.
You are a remarkable young woman. I could not believe it when I heard about you, and so of course, I acted without delay."
She shook her head, wondering what he was talking about. Was he sane?
"Your lover is a very wealthy man, most influential. Until today, he has never shown the slightest weakness, never any way to get to him. Damnably clever, a cold, heartless bastard, like all the keepers of the soul of Estolia, self-righteous, sanctimonious, sexist."
He broke off what he was saying to give in to a prolonged bout of coughing. When he finally got his breath back, he looked out the side window to the small farmhouse before continuing his narrative.
"Then he met you, and anyone who knows the Estolian faith, as I do, knows he fell in love with you."
He looked at her with a skeptical, scornful expression, seeing, no doubt, her forgettable figure, face, and hair.
"I decided to take you immediately, before he knew you better, to intensify his angst."
He heaved a massive wheezing sigh, the air whistling as he exhaled.
"When we are done, you will be freed, my dear,"
he said finally, his voice gentle and paternal.
"He will be faced with a decision, and likely he will make the right one for himself and for his future wife. A woman who will not be a little country bumpkin like you."
Despite his clear disdain for her looks, he seemed sincere. She had few choices available to her. She could fight this man and his brutes, and lose, or she could do what he asked and hope he was as sincere as he seemed.
Hope after disaster kept Ezekiel going, comforted by knowing Deity's plans. How could she be taken, stolen, removed, leaving him forsaken after she is approved? Hope after disaster kept Ezekiel going, comforted by knowing Deity's plans. Then he got that call, that horrible call.
Each keeper learns, within the first few weeks of his tenure, that his position is more powerful than he imagined, more than any man could imagine. The powers that come with a connection to the spirit include the ability to see into anyone's soul, the finesse to know if a woman is conceived, and the sensitivity to know if an individual is lying to him. The power of touch, to the keeper, is far beyond any other sense he has been given. Few men walk upon this planet who can keep the soul of Estolia, wield this power, and not be tempted to use it in ways that Deity never intended. Lazarus, Ricard and Zakarian, Capitulo 84.
Zeke set the phone on the desk in front of him and focused on the far wall. He was trying to take it all in. Absently he rubbed the scars on his leg as he replayed the bizarre phone call.
How could she be taken, stolen, removed, leaving him forsaken after she is approved?
Just after Zeke was ushered into Thaddeus' office, one of his assistants interrupted them.
"I'm sorry, sir,"
she said.
"We've received an urgent phone call from Mr. Zakarian."
Thaddeus' thick bushy brows crowded close to one another, and he commanded in his deep grumbly voice.
Bring him a phone.
Zeke was wondering if it was his Uncle Theo or his brother Isaiah calling him. That brought thoughts of Cadorin's beautiful aura back to him, and he was smiling when he took the cordless phone from the assistant.
Listen up, Lazarus Ezekiel Zakarian.
The voice was cold, emotionless, hissing each of his 3 names with machine-like precision. Zeke sat up straight, the warmth of his memory of Cadorin turning to ice. Something was dreadfully wrong.
Lazarus speaking.
He said, not bothering with his familiar name. His eyes met Thaddeus' eyes. His friend was alert and listening.
Listen carefully, Lazarus. Your future depends on it.
The cold atonal words were ricocheting through his mind. Every instinct he possessed told him his life itself depended on listening and understanding and remembering everything this man had to say to him.
You have my full attention,
he said into the silence, his voice gruff with suppressed emotion.
Who are you? What do you want?
In a moment we will be joined on this call by a young woman of your acquaintance. Such a delightful young woman. It would be a great pity if something dreadful was to happen to her orange curls or freckled face.
Hello?
The voice was hesitant. The memory of her voice rippled through his nerve endings like a jolt of electricity. He thought, when he first saw her, that she might speak with a country accent, sounding vaguely uneducated, in keeping with her appearance as a country girl. But when he first heard her voice, it was sultry, seductive, silky smooth, and highly educated. Now, however, it was tense, shaky.
Cadorin, are you okay?
He asked. He could hear someone speaking in the background with a menacing voice, not quite intelligible.
Ezekiel, I think I've been kidnapped.
The original voice was on the line again, clarifying.
She has been kidnapped, Mr. Zakarian, and if you want to see her again, you will do exactly what we tell you to do.
He heard a clicking noise and wondered if the phone call was over. But the voice continued.
She is no longer on the line, Lazarus. You will never speak with her again if you are unwilling to follow my instructions exactly.
What do you want from me?
Zeke asked.
I know you think Cadorin is the right woman to marry, to keep your soul, but you will not marry her. If you do, she will not live long enough to see Estolia.
Zeke was rocked to his core. This man was either Estolian or knew more about Estolia than any outsider had a right to know. But if he was Estolian, if he understood the faith, how could he possibly expect to dictate who Zeke married?
You will not seek help from the police. They would not understand the details. You will also have Montclair call off his dogs. I will give you 10 days to ponder the wisdom of marrying Brittany Davalos. If you refuse to work with me, in 10 days, I will send you an incentive. Miss Cicero is an artist. Perhaps she will mourn the loss of her right hand, or her eyes. It is 1:42. Expect to hear from me in 22 hours and 18 minutes to discuss this further. Do not expect to have any success in tracing this or subsequent phone calls. I have very good men working for me.
Radiated, scintillated, indicated her place on Estolia's shores.
Once he finished reviewing the past momentous 5 minutes, he looked at Thaddeus.
I could hear the entire thing.
Thaddeus said.
I got my men to try and trace the call, but he wasn't boasting. The people he has working for him are good at what they do. It seems we have 22 hours to locate Brittany Davalos, to try to figure out if she can help us. Do you know anyone by that name?
Zeke frowned in thought. His assistant Marcus told him something about a woman he had met. He always called her Brit. Marcus was worried that she would not want him since he was confined to a wheelchair. Zeke thought Marcus' last message was definitive. He was going to be in seclusion for a week. With Brit. He explained to Thaddeus about his assistant.
I don't pretend to understand everything about your faith,
Thaddeus said.
But what I do know tells me that this is an impossible situation. If your friend Marcus has married the Brittany this man expects you to marry, then it's impossible to comply with his demands.
Thaddeus, I could, I suppose, go through a marriage ceremony with someone other than Cadorin, but I could not consummate it.
His voice broke and he had to swallow on the emotions surging through his system. Closing his eyes, he tried to reach out to Deity, seek solace, find inspiration. His emotions were too tightly entwined in the situation. He could not achieve the necessary emotional distance for communicating with Deity. Taking a deep breath, he opened his eyes and sat up.
I must speak with my uncle Theo and with my assistant Marcus. Nothing can be done until we gather more information.
I'll clear my calendar, Zeke. I'll help you in any way I can.
Thaddeus' voice was thick with compassion and, to Zeke's ear, the anticipation of impending sorrow for his friend.
Ezekiel, how can they overcome this madness? Hope after disaster kept Ezekiel going, comforted by knowing Deity's plans. How could she be taken, stolen, removed, leaving him forsaken after she's approved? Or is confirmation heart's destination? Insanity and despair, his former faith corrupted. The abductor didn't care, transition interrupted. Enriching your heart, character, defining art, enhancing your life with your Kaylee, your wife. When you chase your dreams, your imagination streams, and your heart is pure.
Misplaced religious fervor has oft been tied to that period of insanity leading up to the crisis point, that pivotal period in Earth's history when, without intervention, our ecosystem might have made that irrevocable transition from illness to impending death. So many of the factions that brought us to the brink of destruction claimed religious zeal as the focal point of their activities. What was not clear to many of those who fought and died for their faith was how manipulative those who stood to profit could be. It was not hard for the various elements of the Parity Collective to nudge circumstances in their favor. Later, as the project gained momentum, the biggest obstacle that stood between it and success was, ironically, the fact that the project was backed by not one, but two separate religions. Those who retained their sanity in that turbulent period of near annihilation developed a distaste for the way religious zealots were the pawns of parity, fighting against their own interests with the prodding and prompting of those skilled at taking advantage of them. With their purported motivations, religious in nature, it was easy to want to classify those working on the project alongside those who sided with parity. It was Quinn Sanders, in a candid moment, caught on video when he was discussing the science of the project and the way that both Hathi and Estolian beliefs supported independent thought that brought about the change of heart necessary to help garner the support needed to allow the project to prevail. Osiris Zakarian, on obstacles hindering the project.
Kadarin had the run of the house. However, in addition to the old man, there were 5 brutes to make sure she did not escape. Once or twice she considered flinging open a door and making a dash for it, but each time she looked up and saw Hector's eyes on her. He was a large, heavily muscled man with close-set eyes and a low forehead under thick unruly black hair. The other men were there on a job and would do what it took to keep her captive. But Hector scared her. Based on the way he looked at her, she would regret it if she escaped, and it was Hector who caught up with her. With Hector's eyes on her, she was effectively chained to the small house. She spent most of her time painting Ezekiel. Her first one was just a portrait. She thought about him while she worked on his features. She began with a watercolor, the medium she always used for her preliminary work. It caught the essence of the subject, was more intimate and detail-oriented. Working from memory, she was able to capture his appearance. He had amber eyes and dark blonde hair, a firm determined chin, sharp intelligence and an undefinable sense of purpose. His face was narrow, serious, sincere, and sexy. She was surprised she could remember so much. Every detail of his face came to her with perfect clarity. Her second painting, in acrylic, coalesced in her mind as she finalized the first one. Sometimes it was like that for her. She would feel an urge to put on canvas the vision from within, and could not put it off. She closed her eyes and pictured him climbing to his feet in the park as she was saying goodbye to her friends. His well-shaped hands brushing grass off his trousers, straightening his pale green shirt, and reaching up to adjust his purple and gold tie. When he had approached her in front of her house, he had a pronounced limp, and she remembered thinking that walking must be painful for him. With that memory clear in her mind, she suddenly visualized what she would paint. He would be standing, his hands clasped, just looking towards her. The background was unimportant. She pulled her sketchbook close and began to sketch his outline, feeling the familiar joy to be expressing herself with her talent. While she tried to keep her fears far from her mind, she felt as if her work was substantially better than anything she had done before, given the possibility that she would never know true freedom again. As she worked on Ezekiel's outline, she frowned. There was something wrong with the suit he was wearing. Perhaps she would not have him wearing a tie. After several additional attempts, she decided that he wouldn't wear a suit either. Her next sketch was just an outline. She filled in the details for his face, trying to listen to her heart so she would know what to have him wearing. The longer she worked, the more it changed. None of the things she drew really seemed to work. She never quite captured the image that was clamoring within her for release. Her pencils were scattered all over the table. When she gathered them together, one of them inadvertently slipped out of her hand, leaving a dark mark on the sketch she was preparing to throw in the trash. She looked at the way the mark connected his ankles and was suddenly inspired. Flipping to a new page in her sketchbook, she worked rapidly, feeling how right this new image was when compared with all the previous ones she discarded. When she was done, she leaned back and looked at it, fascinated. Ezekiel was transformed from a businessman into a monk. She could already visualize what the finished product would look like. The robe would be a blaze of colors, she thought, with a purple base color, augmented by elaborate embroidery in green and gold, tied at the waist by a braided cord with metallic gold in caps falling to knee level. With the strength of inspiration, she began to paint. Everything she had envisioned came to life before her, and the more time she spent on the painting, the more she admired him. She spent nearly a week working on that second painting. It was a time seasoned in the day by occasional discussions with Joseph, and, more frequently, peppered by conversations she overheard in a foreign language that often turned into shouting sessions with, she suspected, Ezekiel on the other end of the line. The muscle-bound helpers seemed to speak most frequently in Spanish. Only Hector conversed with Joseph in the language she could not identify. If infrequent conversations and incomprehensible diatribes on the telephone were the flavor of her days, her nights were spiced by Ezekiel himself. In her dreams, she was kidnapped and he always saved her. The method changed every night, but the result was always the same. Once he rescued her, taking her away from the little farmhouse, he would pull her into his arms. He would be trembling, and when she looked into his eyes and saw his tears, she wept with him in reaction to all that had taken place. After their tears dried up, he would cup her face and say to her,
"I love you, Quedarin Cicero, from now until the end of time."
He would kiss her and they would end up passionately entangled in a swan-shaped bed. In the tradition of the romantic novels she loved to read, he would ask her if she would marry him, be with him forever. The dream would always make it to the very instant before their passion was consummated, and then reality would intrude. She would wake up, gasping, frustrated to be deprived of this man claiming his reward for being her knight in shining armor. Shortly after she finished the second portrait, she took her largest canvas and began to pour her heart onto it. She rarely painted without a sketch or a plan. Her art instructor was adamant that the best art, the type that was admired in 100 years, was planned out, not just poured onto the canvas like some out-of-control mindless splatter of random pigment that critics loved and those with culture hated. She had never quite agreed with him, but she had made a comfortable living from what he taught her. Now, for some reason, she felt compelled to do everything he derided. She had to allow her talent full latitude. When she was finished, she looked at it in awe. It was the best thing she had ever done. Ezekiel was more dynamic in this painting than in the others, as if he could step out of the canvas and pull her into his arms. In it he was standing, his legs widely spaced, the hem of his robe flaring in a breeze. One leg was slightly forward of the other and his left hand held at chest height, palm up. He held a dagger in his right hand, and the blade, serpentine and etched with foreign symbols, rested horizontally on his palm while he gripped the jewel-encrusted handle.
Your soul through and through.
One man's crazed vanity, deity's plan swept away. With a madness, deflection, babbling insanity, as time trickles away with one swift rejection.
In my youth I spoke with the captain of a merchant vessel that almost sank off Estolia's northern shore. Having spent 3 months living in Estolia while the ship was repaired, the captain was most intrigued by our religion. I tried to explain to him the promises of deity, but did not then know if I was able to express myself properly. I told him that I was the heir apparent and that I would, in the fullness of time, find a bride and have a most incredible exchange with her, one that would bring me great joy throughout my life. When he asked for clarification, I told him that my future wife and I would each trade something of like value, her virtue for my soul, and that deity would seal the exchange with living proof in the form of a son to bless our marriage bed. I do not think that anyone was surprised when Captain Tethys saw my sister's beautiful aura and opted to remain in Estolia. He could not know that he was the descendant of one of the disaffected who left Estolia in the time of Apollyon. My uncle and my brother quietly rejoiced to have one of the lost reclaimed. Joseph Vincariot Zacharian, Capitulo 62.
Zeke looked at the calendar bleakly. He had less than 72 hours remaining before he turned 31. The only thing that kept Caterin safe was the fact that Brittany was nowhere to be found. They were convinced by this time that it was her father, Joseph de Volos, who had kidnapped Caterin. He could hardly punish Zeke for his daughter being missing. But the threats grew more gruesome daily.
If you do not give your soul to her, Lazarus,
he half screamed down the phone to Zeke.
I will send your darling Caterin to you chopped up in a dozen pieces, airmailed from every corner of the earth.
Zeke was grateful to Thaddeus for taking charge, giving him a place to sleep, and working with him to try to locate Marcus Albans, Brittany de Volos, or Joseph de Volos. Even the keeper, Theo, had no clear words of advice.
This drama, Zeke, is something that must play out to its conclusion. Ultimately, Deity is with us, helping us, bringing us the greatest of blessings. But Deity cannot force events or outcomes. Deity can only place us within these challenges and wait to see if we have the strength of character to make it through to the other side.
Zeke set up his command center in an unused office 3 doors down from Thaddeus. He was looking at the information spread out on a large bulletin board when the door opened and a platinum blonde woman came bursting into the office like a miniature tornado. He had studied dozens of photographs of Brittany de Volos, so he did not need to guess her identity. The photographs did not give the full story, however. This woman was not only beautiful, she was poised and had an unmistakable iron will, a woman with the strength of character he might have found attractive, if Caterin did not hold every particle of his heart. He recognized the glow on her face instantly. This woman was coming out of seclusion, married and indelibly attached to one man for the rest of her life. Now that he had confirmation that she kept another man's soul, it was impossible to accede to her father's demands. By the time these impressions went through his mind, the door was opening again, and this time Marcus Albans was wheeling into the room. When he saw Zeke, he grinned widely.
Zeke, I got about 8 different messages that you were looking for me. Sorry, buddy.
He paused to look up at the beautiful woman who had closed the distance and was now standing at his side, her hand on his shoulder.
I was in seclusion with Brittany. We decided to go to Vancouver, and then stayed longer. Have you met Brittany? Britt, this is my best friend and former boss, Zeke. Soon to be the keeper. Zeke, my wife, Brittany Davalos Albans.
Have you seen or spoken to your father?
Zeke asked Brittany without preamble. The look on Brittany's face went from the glow of new love to the burden of family love, when the loved one was more likely to cause pain than happiness.
Why? What happened?
An hour later they were all seated around the conference table silently. Marcus and Brittany were trying to absorb the implications of what they had just heard.
How much longer do you have until your birthday?
Marcus asked. Zeke stared at the calendar.
A little less than 3 days.
My father must be found before it's too late.
Brittany said. She looked from her husband to Thaddeus to Zeke.
He will be in one of 3 places, here in California, in Hawaii, or in Switzerland.
She closed her eyes and took several deep breaths.
I think we need to split up. Zeke, you should go to his chalet in Switzerland.
Zeke wanted to object. What if Kadarin was still in the United States? He needed to be where she was.
Marcus can investigate whether he has taken her to his condominium in Honolulu.
Brittany continued.
And I will check to see if he is in a half-dozen possible locations here in California. It is the only way.
She outlined how they would each handle it if they discovered her father. Logistically, the most important thing in their plans was making sure that Zeke and Kadarin were brought together before the deadline. Thaddeus would help with transportation. Once Theo was told of their plans, he assured them that the 3 corporate jets would continue to be at Zeke's disposal. Every available pilot and airplane in the Zakarian fleet was already in California to aid their efforts. Once they found Kadarin, they would be tasked with making sure that Kadarin and Zeke would end up in the same place prior to his birthday. If it was possible.
Glorious pathways of tradition, the aura's beautiful guide. Extraordinary permission, leading men to their bride. Talents and gifts, challenges and blessings. A balancing scale comparing these things. Deity's tariffs, hail hearty and well, given great health, their families secure, don't squander their wealth.
I have often wondered about the edict that Estolian men must marry by their 31st birthday. On the face of it, it sounds cruel, as if a man's happiness was left to the vagaries of chance. As if Deity would punish any man, and the woman, if he was unable to find her until he was 31 or older. However, in my later years I realized that Deity is close to the hearts of all Estolians. We would never be left in a state of celibacy unless that was a choice we made. Deity influences human affairs to bring every man into the orbit of his Kali before it is too late. Later, after this epiphany, I asked Jeremiah and his Kali to research the number of men who lived their lives celibate. I expected the number to be low, but was unprepared for just how few men had been left alone and lonely for their entire lifespan. I was not surprised, however, to discover that in every single instance, it was due to the choices that the man made in his life that left him alone. Nicodemus, Luciano Zakarian, Capitulo 89.
Early on the 19th or 20th day of Kadarin's captivity, a yellow sports car came blazing into the yard, the brakes stirring up a billowing cloud of dust. A woman leapt from the car and came tearing into the house, going straight up to the old man. Her voice was low-pitched, the words spaced for emphasis.
I will not be manipulated.
She slapped him, hard, across the face, her slap punctuating her words. A hand-shaped imprint first in white, and then angry red marked his face.
Brittany?
He said hesitantly.
What?
She interrupted him forcefully.
I know you've been trying to get Zeke to marry me. I won't accept it, or him.
But you have always wanted him.
How can you be so blind? I do not want Zeke. I have never wanted him.
Well then, who do you want?
He asked before saying.
You do not want Marcus, do you?
I have always wanted Marcus. You know that.
Marcus is no good.
He said dismissively.
You will never have children. Never be a wife to him. Lazarus is the man for you.
No, Papa, this is not true,
she said.
And I've already married Marcus. Even if Zeke begged me to be his wife, I couldn't do it.
Red crept into his face in a flood, hiding the lingering imprint of her slap. He kept shaking his head, but said nothing.
It is true, Papa. I'm not going along with your plan. Even if Zeke wanted me to, I couldn't. I would rather die than live without Marcus.
Her father finally found his voice, his tone beseeching her.
But you have always wanted children, Brittany, always. How can this man fill the void in your soul?
Oh, Papa, have you so little faith in me, in my heart?
She turned to smile briefly at Caderin before looking again at her father.
I do want children, and I will have children. Marcus may be in a wheelchair, and he may have nerve damage to his legs, but it is to his legs, Papa. His legs.
As her meaning became clear, the color that had flooded his face seconds before receded, leaving only the red handprint on his pale face. He stuttered before groaning and rubbing at his eyes. Suddenly his voice was firm, resolute.
I do not wish you to have such a burden, child. I cannot imagine Marcus wishes it either.
Ignoring his last remark, the volatile bundle of feminine energy turned to Caderin and said,
I must take her to Zeke. You ruin his life if he does not marry before his 31st birthday.
The older man moved swiftly to block the door, shaking his head.
It is not right. He will never make you happy. You believe he will give you a child, but he cannot.
I'm already pregnant,
she told her father.
But even if I wasn't, how could I ever do anything to cause Marcus pain? You insist Zeke break Marcus's heart to free this woman. Not only that, you insist he does the impossible. I cannot marry Papa, as I'm already married. You condemn us all to unhappiness with this insanity.
The old man stumbled backward and sat hard in one of the chairs. Softening, the young woman dropped to her knees in front of him and took his hands in hers. Looking up at him, her voice was gentle.
If we delay much longer, Zeke will never marry. That will cause Marcus great distress, which will, in turn, bring me great sadness. There is only one man whose soul I could have ever kept, and I keep it quite safe indeed. He possesses my virtue, and I his soul. You must accept this.
She stood and reached for Caderin's hand. With one last look at her father, she dragged Caderin out of the house to her car. She returned to the house, and a few minutes later was back with Caderin's things, including her paintings. After she climbed into the car, she gunned the engine. Gravel spit from under the tires as she roared down the unpaved road. The woman paused for traffic at the crossroads and turned to Caderin to introduce herself.
My name is Brittany. I am married to Marcus Albans, Zeke's assistant. When Father abducted you, Zeke told me what was at stake and asked for my help.
I don't understand any of this,
Caderin said.
I only just met Ezekiel an hour or so before I was abducted.
I don't think it matters,
Brittany said, grinning briefly towards her before concentrating on her driving again.
Zeke is like Marcus, both are Estolian. One look is all it takes. Wham! They are in love.
An hour later they were at a private airfield, driving straight up to a helicopter. Brittany braked the sports car and said,
This is your ride. Ronaldo will take you to Zeke, and Zeke will take good care of you.
Caderin climbed out of the car, while Brittany pulled her suitcases and paintings from the trunk and, without another word, drove swiftly away.
The heir to Deity's timeline. Citizens happily sleep in the sureness and faith of the stray Aaron's control. The dagger, the temple, the preordained role of their future king. The promise of Estolia's future sublime last resort promises to keep. The heir to Deity's timeline, citizens happily sleep in the sureness and faith of the stray Aaron's control. The dagger, the temple, the preordained role of their future king.
One of the sentiments I heard frequently as our planet approached the tipping point was the idea that a rational person could not believe in divinity or deity. It was common to express the opinion that anyone who did believe was suspect as to their sanity, rationality, and intelligence. To them, the glorious intricacies of the world around them were the product of evolution and science, and deity had little or nothing at all to do with it. How could I, as a man of science, explain what I felt? That I saw the same things they did, but whereas they saw a lack of divinity, I saw an abundance. Abundant proof that our world is one of the finest pieces of art ever produced, and that we were all actors on some grand stage. As one of those peculiar individuals who would eventually call themselves adherents to two separate faiths, I could only watch the unfolding drama with a sense of smug righteousness. Benzan Aziari, Diary.
In shock, she watched the sports car driving away. Only when it was out of sight did she turn to evaluate her new situation. A swarthy man jumped out of the helicopter and gestured her close. Not sure what else she should do, she went to him. He gestured for her to climb into the aircraft and gave her a headset to put on. Once she was seated, he walked over to the possessions that Brittany had left in an untidy pile on the gravel. The first thing he picked up was one of her paintings. He stared at it intently, before looking through the rest of the stack. He glanced towards where she sat in the helicopter. With a shrug, he tucked the paintings under one arm and picked up her suitcases. Everything went in the space behind her seat. The pilot did not speak much English. He said several things to her, but his accent was thick. When she couldn't understand anything he said, he lapsed into silence. As the ground fell away beneath them, she wondered what would happen next. The entire confrontation with Joseph and Brittany had been so sudden and vitriolic, so incomprehensible, that she was still trying to process those nuances when Brittany dragged her here to this helicopter. If she had been thinking clearly, she would have asked to be taken to the police. Which was probably why Brittany didn't give her a chance to really ask any questions, and why she left her with this pilot who did not seem to speak English. She clearly loved her father, even if she was furious with him. She would not want Kadarin to go to the police. Would not want her father jailed. After about an hour they landed next to a sleek private jet. Once its rotors started to slow down, several young men approached the helicopter and, after a quick conversation with the pilot, pulled her belongings out and carried them to the jet. A woman came over to where she was still sitting in the helicopter and opened the door for her, gesturing for Kadarin to follow her. When they reached the mobile staircase leading into the airplane, Kadarin tried to find out what was going on.
Where are you taking me?
The woman did not seem to understand her question. Her command of English seemed even more lacking than the pilot of the helicopter. She gestured for Kadarin to ascend the airplane steps.
What's going on?
She tried a different question. Unfortunately, that seemed to puzzle the woman just as much as her other question. They were at a small, private, and seemingly abandoned airfield. There were only a few airplanes and no other people. Fleetingly she wondered if she had gone from one set of kidnappers to another. Sensing her reluctance to board without further information, the woman said to her,
Mr. Zakarian, we take you to him. It is Una?
Her eyes rolled upward, as if she was trying to find the correct word written on the inside of her skull. She looked again at Kadarin, and said with heavy emphasis,
Una emergencia.
And then, in case she did not understand, the woman repeated in English,
An emergency, please.
She looked distressed and frustrated by the language barrier. An emergency? Kadarin didn't know what to do. But if she had in fact been freed from the insane Joseph by Ezekiel Zakarian, she needed to thank him, at the very least, for rescuing her. She had come to accept that her destiny was outside her control over the previous 3 weeks. She hesitated before climbing the stairs. Once she was settled in the plush reclining seat, the airplane did not wait around. In next to no time they were climbing into the sky. When they reached cruising altitude, the flight attendant brought her a meal. Kadarin ate hungrily. This was the first time since her kidnapping that she had an appetite. Several hours after she boarded the airplane, she felt a change in the engines. When she glanced out the window, She saw that it was very dark out, but that they were flying into an urban area ablaze with lights. Her pulse started to pound when she thought about how she would soon be with Ezekiel. When she reached to undo her seatbelt, the flight attendant reacted swiftly, saying,
No, this is una petrol fuel stop only.
Once they were airborne again, Catherine tried to sum up her situation. But the only thing she was certain of was that they were now flying over an ocean, and she did not have a passport. Catherine did not sleep much on the long flight. She kept expecting to arrive at their destination. She was just drifting off to sleep when the gentle touch of one of the flight attendants on her shoulder woke her up.
We land,
she said. Catherine expected a certain level of disbelief followed by a hefty amount of concern that she had arrived in a foreign country without a passport. As soon as she got to the door of the jet, however, the flaw in her assumption became apparent. They were not at an airport. All she could see in the vicinity were a set of steps and a small horse-drawn carriage. At the bottom of the steps stood a man who resembled Ezekiel, only 20 or 30 years older. The most remarkable thing about him was that he was wearing the outfit she had painted on Ezekiel. The same colors, the same style. The only thing that was missing was the black sash. How could she have so skillfully painted this outfit from nothing but her imagination? She felt her skin prickle at the thought that forces beyond her control were somehow at work here.
My name is Theobaldo Reginald Zakarian, but please call me Theo. I am Zeke's uncle. My apologies that you were so unceremoniously pulled from your country and brought here.
He guided her towards the waiting carriage as he spoke.
I'm Catherine Cicero.
She introduced herself.
What?
She had to stop to yawn.
What's going on?
You are tired, my dear. In the morning, Zeke will be here and he will be able to explain everything. For tonight, we will bring you to a lovely bedchamber, so you might have a good night of sleep. I was told you ate on the jet, so you will not need to sit through a long, tedious meal.
Catherine's eyes drifted closed during the carriage ride. When it jerked to a halt, her eyes opened. The carriage stood next to a grandiose entrance set into the side of a mountain. As Theo escorted her towards the doors, he explained.
This building is semi-subterranean.
He led her through a spacious foyer, a large empty hall of sorts, through a second larger foyer, and through a set of double doors. When he came to a halt, she looked around the spacious suite curiously. It was quite lovely, she thought, though she could barely keep her eyes open long enough to take in any of the details.
You will remain here until the morning. After you wake up, you will be escorted to where you need to be,
Theo explained. He spent a few minutes showing her around the suite. To one side was a small kitchenette with a miniature refrigerator. In the opposite direction was a bedroom. One entire wall was solid glass facing out into a small garden courtyard. A thick elaborate tapestry held up by a gold and purple braided rope separated the two rooms. Inside the bedroom, a king-sized bed took up most of the space. A small chest at the foot of the bed and a couple of small bedside tables were the only other furniture. On the far side of the bed was a door leading to a bathroom. Theo went to one of the night tables and turned on the lamp. Next, he untied the rope holding up the tapestry, and it swooshed down to separate the bedroom from the small sitting room. He moved over to another tapestry tied up so the garden courtyard could be easily viewed, and that too swung down, throwing the room into semi-darkness. He opened the chest at the foot of the bed, rummaging through it and extracting a garment in white satin.
Here is a nightgown, Catherine. Is there anything else I can get for you?
Sleep was all she really wanted.
No, thank you.
She hesitated before asking.
I will learn more tomorrow?
Absolutely, my dear.
He left the bedroom, and she heard him leaving the suite. Catherine was exhausted, both from the long journey, as well as the 20 days she had been held hostage. The emotional turmoil, the confusion, the insecurity had all taken a toll on her. She could only hope everything would be cleared up in the morning.
The sureness and faith of the stray Yaren's control. The dagger, the temple, the preordained role of their future king. The promise of After disaster kept Ezekiel going, comforted by knowing Deity's plans. Then his heart took a fall when he got the call. Darren was taken, though his faith was shaken.
Given the great love Deity has for Estolians, it is sometimes hard to understand the rigidity of the strictures under which Estolians live. There is no hell as is understood in many other religions, nor is there heaven. But in the life after this life, Torizon, the only desirable outcome is to spend that time with the person you love. To contemplate existence with the one you love by your side, until time ceases to be time, is to envision paradise. And it is seen as the death of the soul for any man to face Torizon alone. Perhaps that is why, when given the choice, Estolian men would rather risk their soul in this life than live alone and lonely for the rest of eternity. Lazarus Ricardan Zakarian, Capítulo 84.
Zeke climbed out of the smallest corporate jet and waved briefly to the pilot. After the jet taxied and lifted off again, Zeke limped over to the horse being held by an acolyte. With a grateful nod, he mounted it and galloped for the temple. After the first mile, he slowed the horse to a trot. If the 10 to 15 minutes he might save by riding the animal into the ground were that critical, he was already too late. While he rode around the shoulder of Mount Estoliana, Zeke cursed the lack of options left open to him. In less than 8 hours he would be 31. He was told Kadarin was exhausted and sleeping in the seclusion suite. He would stop in to see his uncle and then proceed to join her. Since his accident 3 weeks before he turned 30, he spent a lot of time reading and rereading the 4 most pivotal blessings in his life. His Bender Nasara and his Bender Laura were nearly identical, word for word. When his brother became king, and he took on the role of first consul, his uncle's words were more specific. Most profound, however, was the blessing he received when he became his brother's last resort, his Bender Straya. Even with the hints that he would encounter some obstacle, some impediment keeping him from gifting his soul to Darin, the reality might be laughable, if his entire future happiness was not on the line thanks to Brittany's father, Joseph de Volos. In the last 20 days, Zeke learned more than he wanted to know about the ex-Estolian. When Joseph was 22, he abruptly quit the Acolyte program and moved to Barcelona. Shortly thereafter, he ignored the promises of Deity and married the daughter of an American millionaire. From all he could find on the subject, Joseph and his wife were happy together, and 6 months after the marriage she gave birth to Brittany. Joseph worked with his father-in-law and rapidly became indispensable to him. When Brittany was 5 years old, her mother and grandfather were involved in an accident. Her grandfather was killed instantly, and 12 days later, her mother also succumbed to her injuries. This left Joseph with a burgeoning company, millions in assets and cash on hand, and one bereaved child whose world was shattered. He devoted himself to only 2 pursuits: raising his daughter and making his father-in-law's company as lucrative as possible. He never found another woman to love, and became obsessed with granting his daughter anything and everything she ever wanted. But his focus became twisted and entwined with his half-completed religious education. He was convinced his daughter should marry an Estolian and devoted more and more of his energy towards that goal. His company did business with Estolian Industries in California, and when she was 20, he got Brittany a job working at the San Francisco headquarters of the American division. How he had fixated on Zeke for his daughter was something only he could answer, but when he did become obsessed, he was willing to use his wealth to see his daughter married to the keeper, by fair means or foul. Meanwhile, his goal for his daughter to marry an Estolian did come true. When she met and married Marcus Albans, he was just the wrong Estolian. None of this mattered, Zeke thought to himself, except the material result of Joseph's insane interference was that Zeke would not have the chance to get to know Kadarin or have any sort of leisurely seduction. His pathway was clear. There would be no time to explain, no chance to get to know her gradually. He had to go to her, as exhausted and distressed as she was from nearly 3 weeks of being a hostage, and storm her defenses, woo her with his body, obtain her consent, and gift her his soul before midnight. As keeper, he would be in place to advise many young men in their romantic decisions. He would never encourage any Estolian to choose the pathway that he, Zeke, was now forced to take, for fear of the very real consequences of rejection. Joseph de Volos had taken away Zeke's choices. If he did not consummate the union before midnight, he would have to resign as first consul, and last resort, and live his life celibate. No, he had to have faith in the blessings he received and pray Deity would guide him so that the woman who was already more precious to him than life itself might accept him and keep his soul safe. When he arrived at the entrance to the temple, another acolyte was waiting to take his horse. He dismounted and took the stairs as quickly as his lame leg allowed. He was grateful for the acolytes. They were aware of the drama playing out, another exciting capitulo being written right before their eyes. He nodded to those who opened the doors of the temple, and to the one who opened his uncle's office door. Only his uncle was inside. While one might argue this was something that needed the entire Strelleron in attendance, to Zeke it was important only to two men, the current keeper and his successor. Theo waved him to his normal seat. Zeke sat, and took a deep breath. Theo waited while he regained his composure, before his expression grew solemn.
She arrived about 2 hours ago. She is asleep. We will hold a small ceremony in the morning. I have no additional guidance to give you beyond the blessing you received when you became the last resort. Gregorio and Wraith are willing to step forward. They would, however, prefer to remain in their current roles, rather than occupy yours.
Taking a deep breath, Zeke shared.
I believe, Uncle, that Deity has never spoken to me in such a profound voice as it did when I first saw Kederin Cicero. I thought someone had a mirror and was reflecting the sun in my eyes. But it was just those endearing orange curls, bathed in the extraordinary vision of her aura like tongues of flame surrounding her but not burning her.
He paused, frustrated at the inadequacy of the language to properly convey how he felt. After searching for a better way to express himself, he shook his head, giving up. Instead, he said,
She is the one whom Deity has proclaimed will keep my soul. Our trials will bring us greater strength. We have an ever-changing world with challenges that will require the strength of character I see in Kederin. Thank you for your unswerving support. You have made me the man I am now. You taught me to see into the heart and soul of others, and yet, Uncle, I don't think any keeper has seen within another in the way I saw Kederin. Deity is with us.
Theo came around the desk. The two men grasped each other's forearms. Zeke could sense within his uncle that he was ready to yield up his power to the next generation, ready for the end of the transition. He was prepared for the closing festivities that would culminate in the 7-day blessing that Ben Danasara, that Zeke and Kay Darren's first child would receive. Zeke left his uncle's office and passed through the ceremony room. Acolytes were opening doors they were not even assigned to open. He grinned at them in passing. Acolytes were always fascinated when two souls united outside the expected norms. Reading about the exciting exploits of their ancestors in the Capitolos was not as fascinating as seeing the drama play itself out. He was grateful to see his cousin rather than an acolyte manning the doors to the seclusion suite.
Please fulfill your destiny,
Gregorio said. Zeke thumped his cousin on the back, and then slipped into the seclusion suite. It was mostly dark, with the tapestries cutting out the light of the lowering sun shining into the garden crevasse between the greater and lesser peaks of Mount Estoliana. He paused to take a deep breath, thinking about the past 21 days fighting to assure this day would happen. He would proceed with only his gut, heart, and mind, along with the urgings of Deity. He pulled his clothing off, folding it neatly. Once he was naked, he paused to spend one final minute communing with Deity. He felt great peace and a solid sense of purpose. This might not be the typical pathway, nor the advisable one, but it was the right one for him, and for the woman asleep in the other room. He pushed the tapestry aside, so he could slip into the bedchamber. The light from the bathroom shone on the freckled face and curly orange hair of the woman who held the key to his soul. Her nightgown was crumpled up on the floor. He paused to thank Deity for urging her to remove it in her sleep, before he lifted the covers and slipped beneath them.
After disaster kept disease. comforted by knowing Deity's plans. How could she be taken, stolen, removed, leaving him forsaken? After Deity approved, with the aura's confirmation, she's his soul's destination.
Hesitation, indecision, bringing doubts and unease. Unable to envision the aura everyone sees. But glorious truth settled into their souls. There's nothing to lose in accepting their role.
No matter how much I wished to reject Estolia, I could never truly rid myself of the influence of my childhood home and faith. Though I left Estolia at the age of 22, 9 years later I continued to feel the influence and pull of the faith I was taught. What choice did I have, though? There was so much that was wrong with Estolia, I could not remain and be true to myself. If I was not injured in the earthquake, I believe I would have returned with Lydia. Beautiful Lydia. But my injuries made me realize that it was all a sham. I could not live with her as a stunted half-man. This was proof of the insincerity of the promises of Deity. I spurned her, and not a single day passed that I did not regret the loss of her sweet presence in my life. No, there is no Deity, no promise, only the empty shell of hope, imploding under the weight of reality. Diary of Quincy Lucullus Amador.
The feel of a hand on her breast woke her, and she turned over in the bed, her eyes opening and meeting Ezekiel's warm amber-colored eyes.
Ezekiel?
She questioned sleepily.
Hello, Kadarin.
He spoke softly. He brushed the orange curls back from her eyes. That was when it occurred to her. He was in her bed.
Why are you in bed with me?
He smiled a little sadly and said,
I have no choice, Kadarin.
He ran his hand down her arm, to her back, pulling her closer to him. He was not only in bed with her, but they were both naked.
What do you mean, Ezekiel?
He closed the gap between them, caressing her lips gently with his, while stroking the sensitive skin of her back. The nibbling kiss was far from threatening, making her want to be closer to him, reminding her of the erotic dreams she experienced every night of her captivity.
When you were kidnapped, I was unable to court you and earn your love, and if necessary, seduce you so I might be the man to take your purity.
It took a minute for his words to reach her befuddled brain. The feel of his hand stroking her back made her want to purr like a kitten, but his stated intention of taking her virginity did not make her want to purr. She asked, trying to get the details straight.
I was kidnapped to keep you from taking my virginity?
No, Kadarin Cicero. You were kidnapped so that I would be unable to give you my soul as fair exchange for your purity. You were abducted to keep me from marrying you. You were taken so that I might be forced to live my life celibate. You were stolen so that the most profound blessing of my life, and of yours, might likewise be stolen from us both.
He kissed her again and her heartbeat quickened. The warmth of his hand on her face soaked deeply into her heart and warmed it thoroughly. He covered, caressed her breast, arousing her. She pulled back slightly and said,
Ezekiel, I'm too tired and confused for riddles. What are your intentions now and in the future?
Tonight, I hope you will allow me to seduce you, possess you, and in so doing, tie my body, self, and soul to you indelibly.
His voice was thick with emotion. He had to stop to swallow several times, as if he was suppressing intense emotion. He kissed her again before continuing.
In the morning, we will go together to the ceremony room of this temple, where we will proclaim before Deity and the King of Estolia that we are pledged to each other for all time.
His voice changed slightly, sounding hopeful when he added,
So long as you do not reject me tonight or in the morning, we will return here to this seclusion suite for a week together, getting to know one another. and at the end of that time, we will be declared married.
Kay Darren wanted a husband and children. The ingredients for happiness, in her perspective, always began and ended with having family. Growing up in a succession of foster homes left her feeling alone in the world, and yearning to have a family, to belong. Despite her desire to have a family, she had never been tempted, had never wanted any man. But now, with Ezekiel's body pressed up against her, the growing heat of his arousal between them, and the memory of 20 nights of erotic dreams, she wanted him. Her thoughts winged back to the sense of belonging that rushed through her entire being, when this man's uncle told her how welcome she was to this nation. She wanted to experience all that was involved in belonging both to him and, strangely, to this country. She reached up and felt Ezekiel's face. It was smooth, recently shaved. She moved closer and brushed her lips against his.
I thought about you every day I was captive,
she said softly.
I dreamed of the two of us making love, that you cared about me enough to rescue me.
Kay Darren, I would have done everything I could, moved the sun, the stars, and the earth if necessary, to save you, to make it possible for us to be together our entire lives. I have thought of nothing but you, rescuing you, and being with you since I saw you tying the shoelaces of that beautiful child.
That was when she knew she would give in to the clamoring of her senses.
Say you will be mine, Kay Darren, not only for this evening, but for all time. Promise to be mine.
He kissed her again and added,
I have loved you since I first saw you.
Ezekiel, I want to belong more than you can possibly know, but I want to be with you even more than I want to belong. I'm yours, Ezekiel, if you are mine.
His next kiss surpassed the others, going from tantalizing to deeply passionate and sensual. She returned his kiss with all the fire of her soul. In moments that seemed like hours, his hips were settling over her, the rigidity of his body against her, until his eyes met hers in the dim bedroom, and then he surged forward, his body claiming hers. He held her tightly while they both absorbed the impact. For her it was the sensation of his body filling hers, as his soul filled an emptiness within her that she had sensed all her life, but never really recognized until it was banished permanently. Then their bodies were moving together like two parts to a duet, perfectly in tune, each knowing their time and what they needed to do to create the perfect harmony. As they reached the culmination of their union, Kadarin was flooded with the knowledge that he would always be true to her, just as she would be true to him. This was what she had yearned for all those nights of captivity, to have this sense of belonging. She was not his possession, and he was not hers. They were, together, a complete whole, and neither would or could exist without the other ever again.
Darkness, a glimmering light, dancing and bursting, sparkling and bright, indeterminate, mysterious sight. Dancing dust notes. All of my trials, my tribulations, obstacles, barriers, perturbations, all set in place, positioned by foes, enemies of progress. This really shows the plans of the goddess are settling in place.
The role of women in Estolia will never be fully understood by the women of the 21st century and the rest of the world. What Estolians know down to the most cellular level is that a man and a woman are but two halves of one powerful whole, that the synergistic combination of those two halves will become something much greater than each individual part. They accept and embrace that truth, knowing neither half is greater than the other. Ensayo of Kenzie O'Rourke, Zacharian.
Zeke held Kadarin in his arms as she fell asleep. He relived that pinnacle instant when his soul brushed off the final tethers that kept it tied to him, and sank within the extraordinary embrace of her soul, akin to the sense of her body wrapped tightly around his, but more exquisite, more eternal than the transient sensation of physical union. He would record everything he experienced, beginning with the morning he woke and planned to travel to Barcelona to find a woman, any woman, with whom he could fulfill the promise of Zacharias. At the time his focus was more on receiving the fullness of the promises of deity and less on the emotional and physical connection with a woman who would mean more to him than life itself. No, he had not been ready to find sweet Kadarin then, and he shuddered at the thought of how shallow any other relationship would have been. More than once he wondered if he was seeing the aura of some engaging beauty, and he understood now he had been guilty of trivializing everything that mattered about his faith. Deity knew he needed the last year to learn what mattered. Now, he would record everything that happened since he was kicked, everything he learned, and most importantly, he would write about the shortcomings he felt were the impetus behind this critical lesson he was forced to learn. And he would do his best, and fail in the attempt, to share with all future Estolians what it was like to be a part of this incredible union. He remembered a conversation he once had, in the waning days of his grandfather's life, discussing the blessings and the sacrifices that came from embracing the Estolian way. He was tied to Kadarin in life and in death. He would never survive without her. This connection they shared, this beautiful blending of souls, was the greatest blessing he would ever know. Nothing would or could transcend it. He felt a profound gratitude for the position he was born to fill, for the guidance of deity, for the woman who had kept herself pure, so that he might, on this most momentous night, take her purity in exchange for his soul, and pledge his life to her. Gratitude for the gift from deity that was given to all Estolians, a promised son kindling within the womb of the woman who kept his soul. He was excited to experience the lifelong adventure they were beginning together. A sparkling, indeterminate light out of the corner of his eye caught his attention, and he looked towards the entrance to the bedchamber. Frowning, he wondered if he imagined it, but then he decided to investigate. He rose and pulled a bath robe out of the chest at the foot of the bed, slipping it on. He pushed the heavy tapestry aside, so he could quietly slip into the small sitting room. At first, he squinted against the light until his eyes adjusted. It was actually quite dim. In the real world, the sun was just setting on his last day as a 30-year-old. Once the drape fell closed behind him, he felt a prickling at his nape. He was not alone in the outer room. A woman stood near the heavy wooden door leading into the seclusion suite. She had jaw-length straight blonde hair and grey eyes. She was short and wore a feminine version of the robes worn by the keeper.
Kadarin will not reject you,
she said solemnly.
I am glad to hear that.
He said, equally solemn.
I did not wish to yield up my life along with my soul.
He was looking into the eyes of deity.
What are you here to tell me?
I wish only to remind you to study the words of the blessing you received when you became the last resort. There are many layers within it. I know you did not understand how critical it was, but now you are constrained to ponder the words, consider their meaning, and when necessary you are to share your deep insight with those who will need it.
I will,
he vowed.
Estolia has remained in isolation, hidden from the perceptions of the greater world since its inception. But within your lifetime, Lazarus Ezekiel Zakarian, the cloak of security and obscurity will begin to fall away. What you must remember is that this is necessary for the continuing safety of your land. The Estolian butterfly lives far longer than any other species of butterfly. It can spend from 1 to 3 years first as an obscure larva, growing ever larger, and then it becomes a chrysalis for up to 18 months. No matter how long it remains as an obscure larva, nor how long it bides its time as a chrysalis, it will never fulfill its destiny if it does not have the courage and biological imperative to leave the chrysalis and continue on its life cycle in flamboyant, brilliant color to start the cycle all over again. While the analogy can only go so far, Estolia is very similar. Having matured in obscurity, thriving even through several difficult eras in the history of the world, she must now take the step that will bring her into flamboyant, brilliant color and also bring her to the attention of the world. You, Ezekiel, will see your nation into the beginning stages of this most critical transition.
She fell silent, and glanced away from him, looking troubled. What did Deity think about? What did she see when she looked away from him? What could worry Deity? He felt a shiver of fear. When she spoke again, her voice was husky, almost as if she was having trouble holding back tears.
Without intervention, I fear for Estolia and for this planet. Remember what I have asked you to do within your many blessings. Nurture the offspring of Lilane, and cherish Kadarin Cicero, who is, I am certain you now realize, more precious to you than your soul, or even life itself.
Zeke promised to record everything that she told him, the entire conversation, word for word. He glanced at the small utilitarian desk provided in each of the seclusion suites for recording the important impressions of seclusion, the pivotal moment in the life of Estolian couples. A select few acolytes were given the service task of stocking the suite with beverages and delicacies, with clean linens and leather-bound journals to begin a joint diary for the couple. He was grateful that his acolyte assignment had not included caring for those in seclusion. It was hard enough, while reading some of the more erotic capitolos, to quell the natural reactions of the body. He could not have tolerated being so close to a couple in seclusion. The writing supplies were well stocked, and he felt a deep and abiding gratitude for the many systems that Zachariah's second son, Omador, and his successors established over the centuries. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw another sparkle of indeterminate light. When he looked back, Deity was gone. He closed his eyes and absorbed the impact of knowing he had just conversed with Deity. Then, he crossed over to the desk, pulling out a piece of paper to transcribe his conversation and everything else that had occurred in the last few hours. He would come back to add many other details about the last 13 months of his life, but what mattered now was making certain he faithfully transcribed each of the words of Deity.
In the darkness, a glimmering light, dancing and bursting, sparkling and bright. Indeterminate, mysterious sight. Yeah. Indeterminate sight, mysterious sight.
A magical melding, promises will be kept. Two souls welding, a connection to accept. One glorious truth settled into their souls. There's nothing to lose in accepting their roles.
I was once asked to comment on the apparent inequity in the sexual freedoms of Estolian men and women. Because virginity is only expected of women, there have been many who label the faith sexist. But an honest appraisal of the different expectations for both genders demonstrates that of the two, men have far more limitations placed upon them than women. While Estolian men have the freedom to explore their sexuality and indulge in casual affairs in their 20s, they have extremely rigid requirements in marriage. They can only marry at the age of 30. Those who do not marry before they are 31 will never marry, never father a child, never have their soul kept by a woman. Those men who choose to forego marriage live their lives celibate, incapable of indulging in casual liaisons. Estolian women are expected to remain pure until marriage, but they have far more freedom over when they marry. They also have the added advantage of keeping the soul of the man who is right for them. The freedoms and constraints experienced by both genders are distinctly different, but equal in the serious repercussions for those who flout Estolian marriage customs. Link Zakarian, Ensayo 90.
Kay Darren felt warm and protected. She snuggled closer to the warmth surrounding her. Finally, her dreams had reached their culmination, and she now knew what it was like to be immersed in Ezekiel's love and his possession. When his arms gathered her closer, she realized she was feeling the warmth of a real man in bed with her. Her eyes snapped open as memories flooded through her. She looked into the warm amber eyes of the man who had possessed her in the night. She felt her cheeks heat up and knew she was a most painful color of mottled red.
Good morning, Kay Darren.
He said to her.
Are you well rested?
She nodded, speechless.
I would like nothing better than to stay with you and ignore the outside world. However, we do not have that luxury.
He brushed her curls back from her face before saying,
We must go to the ceremony room. I wish to promise there in our most holy room that I will always be yours.
She searched his eyes for his sincerity. She saw nothing other than truth within.
Do you mean it, Ezekiel?
She asked.
Oh yes, beautiful Kay Darren. I wish to spend my entire life by your side. I hope that your children will be mine, and you will consent to be my wife, to be by my side every single day until time ceases to be time.
There were some things she wanted more than simply belonging. Even though she barely knew him, she wanted to be with this man for the rest of her life, just as he expressed it, until time ceased to matter.
Ezekiel, I don't ever want to live without you.
She was rewarded with a brilliant smile.
I am sorry that our courtship was affected so profoundly by the rantings of an unbalanced man. I did want to spend time getting to know you before making you mine. But in my culture, if a man does not consummate his union by the time he is 31, he will never marry, never have children. Today is my 31st birthday. I was out of time and out of options. I did not wish to push you, but I could not live without you. I hope to live my life in a way that you will forgive me for pushing you so quickly into this relationship.
He kissed her for several minutes until she was aware of a growing heat between them. Reluctantly, she reminded him.
Didn't you say we had to go somewhere?
You are quite distracting, my love. But yes, we must make our way to the ceremony room. Afterwards, we will return here, where we will spend a week getting to know one another.
Ezekiel handed her a beautiful gauzy dress, with a green bodice and a purple flared skirt. He pulled on a robe that was very similar to the one he wore in her painting, although this one was less elaborate. His final item of apparel was a black sash pinned at his right shoulder and left hip. She should have been surprised that he was dressed just as she painted him, including the black sash that she had accurately rendered in intricate detail, but after seeing his uncle in a similar outfit, she believed that Ezekiel's deity had influenced her in some way. He extended a hand to her. She took it and felt a sense of profound happiness, like she was coming home after being banished for a lifetime. He led her to the door and it opened as they approached. A man with silver blonde hair stood holding it. His robes were simpler than Ezekiel's. While he said nothing, Kadarin could tell that an understanding of some sort passed between the two men. They entered the ceremonial hall that she had barely noted the previous day. Ezekiel led Kadarin around and to the front of the dais to mount the steps, stopping one step below the upper surface upon which three men stood. He stopped behind her and pulled her back slightly against his lean frame, placing one warm hand on her abdomen. The three men were stunning when viewed together. In the middle was Theo, the man she met when she arrived, dressed as formally as he had been the previous day. On his right was a younger man closer to Ezekiel's age. He did not wear robes, but instead wore a dark outfit made bright by the swirl of an embroidered cape, a ceremonial sword strapped to one hip, and a thick jeweled crown upon his head. The man on Theo's left was dressed in similar fashion, but with a slender crown. He appeared to be Theo's age. Theo spoke.
Lazarus Ezekiel Zakarian, it is your 31st birthday. Did you find and place your soul within the keeping of a woman prior to this day?
I, Lazarus Ezekiel Zakarian, have placed my soul securely within the keeping of Kadarin Cicero. This I did prior to the sun setting on my last day as a man of 30 years.
Theo's attention turned to Kadarin, and he looked solemn as he stared at her.
Kadarin Cicero, you were brought here to Estolia without your consent, and the man holding you, Lazarus Ezekiel Zakarian, clearly took without asking.
He looked troubled.
Therefore you are not constrained to remain with him. If you wish, we will transport you back to California with appropriate recompense for your lost commission, and you can try to forget this time of your life. What do you choose, Kadarin?
I don't want to ever be separated from Ezekiel.
Theo's eyes met hers, perhaps evaluating her sincerity. After a pause, he nodded.
You will return to the royal seclusion suite. In 7 days, if the Spirit sanctifies your union, it will be formalized.
He turned to Ezekiel.
As the future keeper of the soul of Estolia, you will remain 1 additional day in the seclusion suite. May your blessings in marriage fully eclipse the trials in life that brought you together.
Unable to envision the aura everyone sees. One glorious truth settled into their souls. There's nothing to lose in accepting their roles.
In anticipation, I wait I yearn to see, to feel the sensation of your aura taking me. The fireflies spark, the incandescent glow, brighten the dark, both our souls now know. Fascinated, entranced, your aura speaks to me, by deity enhanced. Love will forever be.
The submerged rocks and those visible to sea-going vessels provided one of the most important protections for Estolia in the ancient world. The island itself looks unimpressive from a distance and unapproachable. The northern channel has a vortex that, according to modern measurements, can drag a small rowboat more than 300 feet beneath the surface of the sea and hold it there indefinitely by the different tidal forces of the maelstrom. The southern channel is even less credible as an access to the inner bays. It is clearly impassable and impossible. Those two channels are obvious deterrents. The middle channel, with fewer impediments, is the true protection against the most determined of assaults. It looks impassable, but to the wary crew, it is entirely navigable. Once this is known, invaders sail the passageway easily, finding with relief the beautiful passageway into Graveyard Bay. The final protection for Estolia is the calm, welcoming waters, hiding innumerable sunken rocks. Forward, biography of Tevilak Niermax.
Zeke stepped out of the shower. His outfit was laid out on the bed. He smiled at Kay Darin. He was tempted to push the outfit to the floor and forget his obligations. He kissed her, feeling the unique sensation of his soul rejoicing in their physical contact. On this day he would learn what it was like to keep the soul of Estolia, the position of ultimate authority in all Estolia, superseding the king himself, if necessary. In practice, he and his brother would share the burden of running the nation, working together, each within their own zone of influence. Kay Darin smiled at him, caressing the smooth contours of his face.
The sacrifices I must make for the position I have,
he said regretfully. He pulled Kay Darin close, amazed, as he had been daily at the extraordinary experience of meeting and winning her over the course of one extremely harrowing month of his life. He closed his eyes and soaked up the ambience of her personality and presence. He kissed her one more time before turning back to the mirror. Yesterday the spirit ratified their marriage, an experience Zeke had always considered a mere formality, a simple declaration. As he stood with Kay Darin in the ceremony room, he learned that there was more to it. In Capitulo 37, one puzzling entry finally made sense, where the last resort knew, with the surety of destiny and duty, that the spirit would not ratify the union of the man who would be sovereign. He understood that, were the sun to rise on Estolia on the 7th day after his brother's supposed consummation, the promise of Zacharias would be broken and Estolia would fall. The events that followed that monumental realization were one of the critical lessons taught within the temple, and stressed heavily in the instruction of the future king and last resort. Alexandros had begged his brother to abdicate, to give up the crown, and enable him to avoid the duty that came with being the last resort. The ratification of marriage in Estolia was no mere formality. Zeke would discuss the experience with his uncle later in the day. He now understood that there was a power that only the keeper could ever wield. He smiled at Kay Darin through the mirror. The source of his power was the woman smiling back at him. She was everything to him. Without her, he would be powerless. He indulged in one more embrace before he moved over to the complete outfit he would wear for the first time. Historical accounts indicated that it was much different from the original worn by Zachariah's second son, Amador. In the beginning, purple was in scarce supply, and the robes were a basic brown with an embroidered edging in purple and gold. Now, they were a rich purple and green with gold embroidery. He pulled on the undergarments, pausing briefly to look with longing at Kay Darin. Then he reminded himself that they would have the rest of their lives to enjoy one another. He closed his eyes and recited the 12 postulates of inner peace compiled by Kay Darrow. In Capitulo 80, Kay Darrow explained their purpose. He had discovered that thoughts about his lovely new bride, Fleur, were apt to bring a physiological reaction, causing him embarrassment and discomfort. To counteract this, he combed through the capitolos and ensayos and found what he considered to be 12 profound postulates, axioms or maxims that were in no way erotic or stimulating. He compiled and titled them the 12 Postulates of Inner Peace. Zeke found, however, that they provided only minimal relief. Turning his attention away, he looked at the next item of apparel, simple white inner trousers. He pulled them on, and then picked up the undershirt. It was also white, with a black diagonal band from his right shoulder to left hip. Over his heart was a stylized representation of the dagger of office of last resort, in elaborate red embroidery. The first office held by the keeper, that of the last resort, was one of the most critical. The last resort was all that stood between the potential betrayal of the heir apparent and utter ruin for all Estolia. It was critical that the keeper remember his role throughout his tenure, and that he teach his successor appropriately. He paused yet again, wanting to look at K. Darin, but he would be uncomfortable if he gave in to his desire. Instead, he pulled on the inner robe. It was a rich black color and obscured his white undergarments. He picked up the outer robe and caressed the fabric. It would hang to his ankles and wrap around his front, tied with a braided gold and purple cord. The most ornate parts of the robe, after the thick tapestry embroidery, were the fanciful sleeves with teardrop-shaped openings. When he put his hands together they formed a V pattern falling all the way to the hem. Last, he donned a slender crown. Within the temple, he would take the crown off like a too-tight hat that was uncomfortable and impractical to wear. His position was one that was recognized by the robes he wore, and the undeniable presence and stamp of the soul of Estolia, giving him the ultimate authority over all things in the nation. His crown was mostly ceremonial. His brother would not have that same freedom. He would wear his crown daily, just as Zeke's role demanded he wear the robes of office. To each their own burdens, he mused. Once the final event in the transition took place, the 7-day blessing for his and K. Darin's firstborn son, he would settle both the crown and the sash of office of last resort, on the green marble statue of Zacharias in his office, an irony, since Zacharias wore neither during his time as their founder. He closed his eyes and mentally thanked the man who founded the nation, for his belief in the promises of Deity. K. Darin would also be an integral part of the upcoming ceremony. Yesterday, after the spirit ratified their marriage, his Uncle Theo and Aunt Georgiana returned to the seclusion suite with them. That was when he learned why it was so critical that he marry, and why he could not be the keeper if he never married.
The fireflies spark the incandescent glow. Bright in the dark, both our souls now know. Fascinated, entranced, your aura speaks to me by deity enhanced. Love will forever be.
A magical melding, promises will be kept. Two souls welding, a connection to accept. One glorious truth settled into their souls. There's nothing to lose in accepting their roles.
The events of the transition in normal times can take 5 or more years to transpire. The average Estolian prefers the time between each transition. 25 or more years without the tension of knowing that their happiness rests on the actions of one single man. From the first event of the transition, which is that moment, a year before the heir's 30th birthday, when the keeper of the soul of Estolia dons again the sash of office, to the time when the new keeper pulls it off and settles it comfortably on the statue of Zacharias after the birth of his first son, Estolians are aware of how dependent they are on the man who will be king, and on his last resort, to keep the promise that Zacharias made. Ulysses, son of Peritasis, Capitulo 37.
Zeke and K. Darin, Theo and Georgiana all sat around the moon-shaped table in the seclusion suite. A carafe of juice and 4 glasses waited on the table for their return from the dawn ceremony ratifying their marriage. Theo filled their glasses and began.
Our faith is generally quite simple. Most Estolians unquestioningly accept the edicts of the faith, reap the rewards, and live full, happy lives.
He was speaking more to Kaydarin now than to Zeke, but Zeke felt that there was enough of a message in what he was saying that he had to pay close attention, just as Deity had urged him to pay close attention to his blessings. Theo settled back in his seat, looking from Zeke to Kaydarin. Zeke waited. His uncle had a habit of coming to the point in his own way and in his own time. Theo turned to Kaydarin and said,
It can be difficult to come to a new nation, learn a new language, and adjust to married life all at once. For the woman who marries the keeper, this creates even more challenges.
Georgiana took up the narrative.
The lovely part is that every single difficulty you might face is easy to overcome when you have your spouse by your side.
She paused and gazed lovingly at her husband. After several heartbeats of silent communication, she turned back and continued.
It would be impossible for me to fill this position without Theo by my side.
Theo added,
The same is true of Georgiana. I could not be keeper if I did not have her to come home to every single night.
Georgiana settled her right hand on Kaydarin's forearm and said softly, gently,
I will be available to you, Kaydarin, anytime you are concerned, uncertain, or lonely. And in those times, remember the one thing I will tell you above all other things. That you have Zeke to give you strength, just as you give him strength.
What is it we need to know?
Zeke asked. Several of the Capitolos included references to this conference with the Keeper as being critical, enlightening, and in some cases alarming. What would he learn?
Kaydarin keeps your soul.
Theo began.
You have spent 7 days learning what it feels like to live without your soul. Having experienced it, does it bring you any concerns about your calling as keeper?
Zeke shuddered. He did have concerns. He knew that the time the Keeper spent away from his Kaylee was substantial compared to most other couples. His life was primarily dedicated to Estolia. It was a great sacrifice, for which he would have substantial blessings in return. But regardless of those amorphous blessings, he still was not sure how he could spend day after day in his office, away from Kaydarin.
Yes, uncle, I have concerns.
He squeezed Kaydarin's hand.
I do not know how I can fulfill my position when separation from Kaydarin is so uncomfortable.
To keep the soul of Estolia, you are given a special gift. You cannot serve Estolia if you do not have a soul to give you strength to get through the inevitable challenges.
Theo's expression was always solemn, but now it was intense and focused.
To do this, you will have one final exchange with Kaydarin and in a way with every Estolian on the planet.
What do you mean?
Kaydarin asked. Zeke could sense mixed emotions coming from her, fear of the unknown and the confidence to face it so long as she had Zeke by her side.
Kaydarin, you will also keep a small portion of the soul of each Estolian in the nation and on the planet.
Theo told her.
But you must accept that your soul will be kept by Zeke just as you keep his soul. This gives him the ability to share with you the burden of keeping the collective soul of Estolia and gives him the strength to do his job.
The twittering of birds in the garden courtyard was the only noise for several minutes. Zeke was thinking about everything he had ever read about this period in the lives of former keepers. Multiple references to this in the Capitolos made more sense now. It was a lot to ask of Kaydarin, especially before she really understood Estolia beyond the background information he shared with her during their seclusion. The reason for an extra day of seclusion for the Keeper suddenly became clear. It provided more time for them to come to terms with this revelation.
Does it hurt?
Kaydarin asked. Theo did not respond right away.
I asked Georgiana because she did cry out, as if in pain during the ceremony. It did not hurt me when I gave her my soul.
Georgiana smiled at her husband before saying,
It was a full-body shock to the system. Very intense, but not painful. I think it is impossible for men to understand.
The smile she flashed towards Zeke and Kaydarin was brilliant in its intensity when she said,
It was the most intimate experience of my life, surpassing the experience of taking Theo's soul into my keeping, enhanced and augmented by the souls of all living Estolians. It is worth it.
One glorious truth settled into their souls. There's nothing to lose in accepting them. Estolian dream, Zachariah's connection, where all our trust reigns supreme. All of our fears defeated, where benefits tremendous. Loneliness has retreated, happiness will surround us.
Emily. I do not think that a day goes by when I do not think about her. Her smile was liquid sunshine, her laughter was bottled happiness. Everything about her was precious in so many ways. I could never, were I to try to describe them all, finish. I have written about her every day in my inscrito as I work my way through this life. The deepest irony for me has always been the words of my Bendelora. I was told then that my lifespan would be longer than most Estolians, and that I would not only enjoy the turn of the century, but that I would realize one day that there were fewer years until the next one than had already passed. At the time, I looked forward to all those years spent with my Emily. How was I to know that those years would be childless? When she spurned me and turned away from me, I thought I would die from the pain of it. I did not seek any other woman to be my Kaylee. I planned to live in solitude. At my mother's urging, I did look around to try to find someone with which to spend my life, but the desire to bed a woman indeed dissipates if a man does not marry by the age of 31. I have lived a celibate life since then. It is only in the last few years that I finally found peace within. When I learned that Emily, sweet, wonderful Emily, knew she would not live long, and loved me too much too, as she thought, condemn me to a short life, and negate my blessing, I can only hope that she will be waiting for me, there in Torrizon, when I am finally able to slough off this body, and discover the vibrance of my inner self, made whole in the life after this life. Jonathan Chauveau, Enscrito.
Zeke's thoughts now returned to the present. Kadarin seemed to accept the information she was given with a deep level of peace. He thought it strange that she was more at peace with what they learned than he was, when she was the one who would actively yield up her soul, and he was the one who would be taking instead of giving. Only the current and former keepers of the soul of Estolia knew what it was like to keep the soul of his wife. Each keeper was given that blessing and that burden. He knew now, beyond all doubt, that this was his destiny and had been from before he was born. The trials in his life only made him stronger for this moment. 2 years ago, when his brother, Isaiah, almost insisted he exercise the office of last resort, a year ago when he suffered the crippling injury just before his 30th birthday, a month ago, as he was forced to listen to Joseph Davolo's insane ramblings of half-understood concepts he learned in his truncated time as acolyte, and just a week ago, the true trial he and every Estolian man felt at the time he yielded up his soul. Every single event in his life brought him to this point in time, this place in time. His life up until now prepared him for a most monumental capitulo. Kadarin came to stand beside him. She was wearing a ceremonial red robe that she would only ever wear twice, during today's ceremony, and as her burial garment. Georgiana had given it to her yesterday and explained its significance. The red of her robe symbolized the blood of Estolia and embodied the place of women in their culture. Just as each individual had body, self, and soul, the nation had a trio of essential elements. The soul of Estolia was their faith and was the most critical element. The body of Estolia was the king and the island. The blood of Estolia, the women, gave it life. Estolia could not exist or survive without women. Kadarin's robe symbolized that essential element. It was something he could never forget. Zeke felt complete as he took Kadarin's hand and led her out of their chamber. They had only a short distance from the seclusion suite to reach the ceremony room. Together, wearing their robes, they went to the dais. His brother, uncle, and father were all waiting for their arrival. He now knew what it meant to be one of the Strelleran of Estolia. Together they had an undefinable, but very real synergistic power that any one man alone could neither have nor harness. He saw that his cousin Gregoria was also there, clearly grateful that he would not be required to take on the soul of Estolia. They approached the dais, kneeling on the embroidered pillows set out for them. Georgiana entered the ceremony room and approached them, coming to stand just behind and between them, her right hand on his shoulder, the stump of her left arm resting on Kadarin's. Theo came to stand in front of them, opposite his Kaylee. Traditionally, the events surrounding the heir apparent, from the time he chose his last resort, to the coronation, were of great interest to the citizens of Estolia. Most of those events took place in the cathedral that stood between Mount Estoliana and Mount Zacharias. Events associated with the keeper were generally not the focus of much attention. They were most important to the members of the royal family, and to those who spent their days in the temple. Theo addressed those who had assembled to witness the event. He focused primarily on the acolytes and elders, but his words were also for Georgiana and other key individuals in the ceremony room. When he was done speaking, his hands settled on top of Georgiana's hand on one side, her arm on the other. Zeke felt a flood of something indescribably sweet rushing through his system, while Kaderin cried out as if in pain, and Zeke understood what it felt like to take another's soul into his keeping. He knew now that without her, he could never have become the keeper. The exchange was just and right and critical. She held his soul but yielded her own up to him, and with it, he took on the burden of the soul of Estolia. It was clear now why Kaderin truly was the most powerful person in the entire nation. Her face was wet with her tears of loss when he finally got to his feet. He was so grateful for her. He saw comprehension on her face, the realization of her role in Estolia. Once they were standing, Zeke swiftly closed the distance between them, gifting Kaderin with the same sense of reassurance that he felt when he came into contact with her, and with his soul. They were one in body, self, and soul, together having the strength to withstand the 30 years or more he would spend as keeper until he passed on the mantle to Isaiah's second son. The joy they felt was far more than anything given to others, a blessing commensurate with the sacrifices they would make in the service of Estolia.
Pathway of tradition, in the Estolian dream, Zachariah's connection, where all our trust reigns supreme. In the maelstrom of modern distractions, with the mad chaos of corporate greed, Estolians' marital benefits, two souls entwined, two futures combined. The pathway of tradition, in the Estolian dream, Zachariah's connection, where all our trust reigns supreme.